Verse 126. Like an elephant magically created, like golden leaves in a painting, the visible world is to the people whose minds are saturated with the forms of ignorance. Well, this sounds quite nice, doesn't it? An elephant magically created, golden leaves in a painting. This is how the visible world appears to people whose minds are saturated with the forms of ignorance. In the context of the last few verses, this is to do with our innate capacity to discriminate forms. Things attract our attention. These things can be pleasant or unpleasant, and we assume they have a reality. It's all very enchanting, and we get caught up in the enchantment. Like an elephant magically created, they must have had outstanding illusionists in ancient India as well. Perhaps it's some kind of hypnosis. An elephant appears to come out of nothing. Elephants certainly attract the attention, but it's magically created. It doesn't really exist. It's a hallucination or a hypnotic delusion. The other example given here is perhaps a little less spectacular, like golden leaves in a painting. So they must have had very good artists in ancient India too, because that's what we see when we look at a painting. We see golden leaves, we see houses, we see beautiful landscapes, but all it really is paint. And we can update this example to what you're looking at now on your computer screen, or on whatever screen you happen to be looking at, because that screen will be made up of pixels, and yet you discriminate forms on it, forms which will either attract your attention or not, and these will be forms which you will assume are based on a particular reality. So this is what the mind is doing. It does it all the time. It's doing it all the time, even when we're not looking at an illusionist trick. The mind is constantly picking out forms and giving them reality. And the only difference between the examples given here and the way our mind actually works is that there isn't any paint, there aren't any pixels, there's no underlying basis for them. It's just the ongoing creative flow, which is the nature of the universe, this infinite creativity which is going on all the time. There is nothing behind it. There is nothing behind all the forms that are continually flowing into creation. They have no substance, no underlying reality, whether it's a dream, whether it's waking, whether it's a painting, whether it's images on pixels. It's all this one process going on. A flow, a mighty ocean. There isn't a word for it. When we wake up in the morning, we describe all of our nighttime experiences as dream. Well, actually, I suppose there is a word for it. There is a word for everything that is going on in the so-called waking state. It's samsara. Samsara. Samsara is what we take to be reality. But it's nothing more than the mind saturated with the forms of ignorance. And once we can feel the truth that there's nothing behind it, there is no underlying reality, that what is as it is in its totality. Once we realize this as samsara, we've automatically stepped out of it, just as we've stepped out of a dream when we realize it's a dream. And the reason we don't accept the totality of what is as it is because we've got this idea of another reality underpinning it. Whether it's scientific ideas or religious ideas. If you were regarding this as just a bunch of pixels on a screen, which is what it is, then you'd lose interest. You'd have nowhere to put your attention to. If everything was just a bunch of pixels, which is how it is becoming for many people, if you realized this, you would switch off from it. You wouldn't allow your attention to be hijacked by it. It would have nowhere to go. There's only pixels. Pixels. Why keep your attention focused on this? And if you looked away from the screen, and the reality all around you was made of no more than pixels, there's nowhere for it to go. There's nowhere for your attention to go. It would have to come back to itself. The attention is the most fascinating thing in the universe. And when this happens, you can get some sense of what I loosely refer to as a sense of being. And at this point, you realize the attention has no need to go anywhere else. There's nowhere else worth going. There's nothing else which is intrinsically more interesting than the attention itself. This is why it's ridiculous to talk about training the mind, at least as far as spiritual purposes go. Because the mind cannot be trained if it believes there is something more interesting outside of itself. I've been using the analogy of modern display devices with pictures made up of pixels. But the actual reality is even less interesting than pixels, because there aren't any pixels. The everyday reality is made up of nothing. you might as well come back to your own sense of being. Allow the attention to rest in itself. This, once again, is enlightenment practice.